In this video, we're going to look at the top 5 most common questions that are asked in support worker interviews, and I'm going to help you plan fantastic answers that's going to get you a position as a support worker. Let's start with the first question that is basically guaranteed to come up, which is, what hours can you work? And there's 3 things you need to show in order to do a good answer to this question. First, you want to show that you are a reliable person, so that the hours that you say you can work, you're likely to be there. So if you've got any records or proof of being reliable, that you've got a good reference and that you're on time at work, that's a really great thing to mention. A lot of people don't mention this on this question, but it's a really powerful thing to mention. You're going to talk about being very flexible, and you're going to say yes as much as possible, because they want people that are going to be there when they need the support workers. So great things to mention, right, that they want to hear is that you can work antisocial hours, night shifts, early starts. Depending on your employer, they might do split shifts, which are really helpful for employers for scheduling. And if you can work the school holidays, that's a definite plus point. Do mention it. If you can't work the school holidays, it's better just not to mention that rather than bring up. Don't volunteer any information that's going to be used against you. And so the key to success on this question is you should always focus on what you can do. Don't talk about what you can't do. The mistake people make on this question is they start going, I can't do school holidays, I'd prefer not to work night shifts, and they just go through all these reasons not to give them the job. And that's not the way to approach the question. So let's move on and look at question 2. You find the person you are caring for collapsed on the ground. What do you do? And there's a really simple way to answer this question. And this is not a trick question. It's not a particularly difficult question, but it's a question if you can't answer, you're not going to get the job. So they're checking that you're safe to be working with vulnerable people. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to say, you're going to get help. You're a support worker, you're not a doctor. All right, so you're going to immediately look for nearby support first. Ideally, you want to get a medical professional, a nurse or a doctor. If you're working in a setting with nurses and doctors available, immediately, they are the priority to get a medically trained and qualified person there. Also, emergency services, if you're working out in the community, you're going to immediately go to the emergency services. If they are, completely collapsed and unconscious, perhaps, maybe suspected heart attack, something like that, the thing to remember is ABCD. So that's airways, breathing, circulation. And then a great thing to mention in the interview and best practice is to identify if there's a defibrillator available and they are clearly labeled. And when you contact the emergency services, they will tell you where one is. And you can use that, and that could save someone's life. So the ABCD and get help. And if you talk about that, you'll reassure them you know what to do. If any of that was totally new to you, you need to read up on this because this is very important. So I'm going to move on to question 3. What would you do if you suspected abuse or neglect? So you're working with vulnerable people. That's why you're a support worker. And so you need to be aware of exactly what to do in terms of safeguarding. So the first thing you're going to do when you're asked any sort of safeguarding question that's to do with safety and welfare, you're going to emphasize your values, that you believe that everyone should be treated with dignity and that everyone is entitled to a life free of abuse, free of neglect, and that everyone's basic needs have to be met. So you're going to show that you've got the right values for the job. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to show that you know the policy. If there's policy information available, you can research that. If there's not policy available, you want to just say in your interview that you're going to be very well versed in all of the policies. You're going to know the person that you got to report any concerns to, and you're going to know exactly what your responsibilities are. You're going to record any observations that you make. So if you see that someone hasn't showered for a month, for example, and they smell really poor, that might be a sign of neglect. And you're going to, log these with the appropriate person. And these are going to, you've got to be mindful of confidentiality. You don't want to be writing these down in places that anyone can see, but you need to be passing those observations on to the relevant person, right? Some signs to look out for. And in the interview, you can mention that you know the things to look out for. So things like unsanitary conditions. If you're a support worker in the community, that's evidence that their needs are not being met. Unexplained injuries. So if the person is injured and they don't have a credible explanation, or they give you a story that doesn't really add up, you ought to be aware of that. If a patient makes a disclosure to you, they say to you that they're being abused or neglected, you need to take that on board. And if you notice any changes in behavior, that's also something to be mindful of. It's not your job to go and do an investigation on this. It is your job to notice these things and pass the information on to the relevant people. So don't investigate it, pass it on to the relevant people, know the steps, and give those 4 things on the arrow in your interview, and you'll reassure them you know what you're talking about. Right, moving on to question 4. How would you deal with an angry or disgruntled patient? And as a support worker, this is something you will come across. And the first thing to always mention, because a lot of people don't mention it, is patient knowledge. That you know the patients that you work with, you get to know them, you keep an eye on them, and so you're aware of what would set a certain patient off. It might be a particular patient reacts badly to certain situations, and so you're going to preempt that. So having patient knowledge is really good, and you're going to know your patients, so you know how to calm them down, you know what they respond to, and you know appropriate strategies for these particular patients. So patient knowledge is a really great way to start your answer. You're also going to make sure that you're going to be listening to them. You're not going to shout them down. You're not going to argue back. You're going to listen if they've got like a concern. The chances are they're really, really angry and eager to get someone to listen to them is often what they're doing. And so if you are listening, that can often go a long way to calming the situation down. So you're going to be calm and composed at all times. You're going to be respectful. You're going to be polite, and you're going to be professional. These are all the great words to get in. Another great word to get in is de-escalation. That means that you're going to get the situation back under control, and that everything's going to slowly head back to normal, and you're going to be leading that process. So get those 3 ideas in and the word de-escalation, and you're going to really impress them with that answer. So let's move on and look at question 5. A co-worker starts arguing with you. What do you do? So there might not be this exact question, but there's probably going to be some question around conflict in the workplace. And there's a general formula for answering any sort of conflict in the workplace situation. The first thing you're going to say is that that's going to be done away from patients. You're not going to argue in front of patients ever. That's an absolute no-no. Anything that is, confrontational, you want to be moving that away from the patients. You're not going to have those discussions in front of patients. That's all moved away. That's absolutely important. You're going to maintain professionalism at all times. You're never going to shout at someone. You're never going to argue back. You're never going to say anything that's not polite. The way to think about it, and you can actually say in this interview, is that imagine that someone was recording every single thing that you said and done. You're not going to do anything that would ever make you feel ashamed or embarrassed about anything of that being on camera, for example. And you can also lastly talk about de-escalation, that you're always calming down the situation. You're not rising to it. You're just staying cool, staying calm, maintaining professionalism, and protecting everyone around you. On the other hand, a bad answer has these characteristics, and you might not say these things, but these do come across non-verbally. So you can get the idea that someone just really doesn't have time for this. It's like, I'm not going to tolerate it, or, I'm not going to have people argue with me, or they immediately go to attacking the other person, be like, that's disgusting, how dare they, kind of idea. They don't necessarily say these things, but it comes across. Talking about sticking up for yourself, that's a bad thing. And if you give any indication that you're going to argue back, you're going to lose the job, and they'll just not take you. So use the things on the left, avoid everything on the right, and you can also say that these are the wrong thing to do. So to argue back, or to have any sort of argument in front of patients is absolutely the wrong thing to do, and that you are not going to do that, and that reassures them. So hopefully this video has been very helpful to you. Best of luck in your support worker interview, and thank you very much for watching.